In the rugged mountains of Sierra County, New Mexico, a 90-year-old war widow lived peacefully in her historic ranch house, tending to her late husband's military memorabilia museum. But when the ruthless Sinaloa cartel mistook her isolated property for easy prey, they were about to learn a devastating lesson. Never underestimate a woman who spent 6 decades married to one of the most decorated Special Forces commanders. In U.S. military history, Margaret "Peggy" Blackwood spent 58 years supporting her husband through covert operations and building connections with America's most elite warriors. Now those bonds were about to remind the cartel why you don't threaten a soldier's family. The morning sun painted long shadows across the weathered wooden porch of the Blackwood ranch as Margaret eased into her favorite rocking chair, her arthritis worn, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. At 90 years old, her body might move slower, but her mind remained sharp as ever, honed by decades of managing the home front, while her husband, Colonel James Blackwood, ran classified operations. Around the globe, the small museum she'd created in the ranch's converted barn had become a quiet tribute to his legacy, displaying carefully curated military artifacts and photographs that told the story of American Special Forces from World War II through Vietnam. From her perch on the porch, Margaret could see the steady stream of visitors making their way up the gravel drive to tour the museum. Most were veterans or active duty personnel, drawn by word of mouth to this hidden piece of military history. She'd never charged admission, considering it her duty to preserve these memories for future generations. The museum had become especially popular with Special Forces teams training at the nearby Fort Bayard, who would often spend hours listening to Margaret's first-hand accounts of Special Forces evolution through her husband's eyes. The sound of tires crunching on gravel caught her attention as Sheriff Mike Torres' patrol car pulled up to the gate. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Mike usually called before visiting. The tight set of his shoulders as he walked toward the porch told her something was wrong before he even spoke. "Morning, Peggy," he said, removing his hat. Despite being in his 50s, Mike still addressed her with the informal nickname she'd earned as a young military wife. "Got some concerns I need to discuss with you." Margaret gestured to the empty rocking chair beside her. "Sit down, Mike. You look like you could use some coffee." He settled into the chair but declined the offered. "Coffee? Been hearing rumors about some new players moving into the county. Mexican cartel pushing north, trying to establish transportation routes through the mountains." Margaret watched a hummingbird dart between the feeders she'd hung along the porch. "Eves, and this concerns my museum because your property sits at a crucial junction. This mountain passes." Mike paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're interested in using local businesses as cover for their operations. They've been approaching ranchers, offering protection in exchange for cooperation." Margaret's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. "I see. And you think they'll approach me?" "I think they already have you in their sights. One of my deputies spotted unfamiliar vehicles watching the property. High-end SUVs, not our usual tourists. The hummingbird zipped away as a dark vehicle, crawled past the property's main gate, moving too slowly to be a casual passerby." Margaret noted the tinted windows, the lack of local plates. "Like that one?" she asked quietly. Mike's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. "Exactly like that one. Peggy, maybe it's time to consider closing the museum for a while, at least until we get a handle on this situation." Margaret set her coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Mike, do you remember what James used to say? About intimidation, the sheriff smiled despite his concern that it only works if you let it. Precisely. Margaret stood, her movements measured but determined. I've spent 60 years honoring my husband's legacy. I'm not about to stop because some criminals think they can frighten an old woman. Mike rose as well, his expression troubled. These aren't ordinary criminals, Peggy. The Sinaloa Cartel. They're ruthless. They've been expanding aggressively, using former military contractors to run their operations. This isn't like the old days. Margaret walked to the porch railing, looking out over the property she and James had bought after his retirement. The museum building stood proud against the mountain backdrop, an American flag fluttering from its peak. Nothing ever is, Mike. But some things don't change. James built this place to preserve history, to honor the sacrifices of his brothers in arms. I won't dishonor that by backing down. The dark SUV made another pass, slower this time. Margaret caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge above her property, someone with binoculars watching the museum's visitors come and go. They were mapping her routines, studying the property's layout, just as James had taught her to recognize during those long years of marriage to a special forces commander. At least let me assign a deputy to patrol more frequently, Mike offered, following her gaze to the ridge. Margaret shook her head. That would only put your people at risk. Besides, she smiled slightly, remembering countless late-night discussions with James about tactical advantages. Sometimes it's better to let your opponent think they have the upper hand. Mike knew that look. He'd seen it countless times when veterans visited the museum, when Margaret would share stories of operations that had never made the history books. You're planning something? I'm an old woman who runs a small military museum, Margaret replied, her voice innocent but her eyes sharp. What could I possibly be planning? The sheriff sighed, recognizing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. Just be careful, Peggy. These people, they won't see you like we do. They'll only see an easy target. Margaret walked back to her rocking chair, easing herself down with the deliberate movements of age. Then they'll be making the same mistake others have made before. James always said the best advantage is the one your opponent gives you by underestimating you. As Mike reluctantly returned to his patrol car, Margaret retrieved an old, leather-bound address book from beside her chair. She began leafing through pages filled with names and numbers, many annotated in James's precise handwriting. Contacts. From his decades of service, fellow commanders, operators he'd trained, men whose lives had intertwined with theirs through years of classified operations. The dark SUV made one final pass as Margaret reached for her phone. She noted the vehicle's precise movements, the professional way it maintained optimal surveillance distance. These weren't ordinary cartel soldiers. They had military training, just as Mike had warned. Margaret's fingers moved slowly but surely over the phone's keypad, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, Director Walsh's office. Margaret smiled, remembering countless dinners with James and Robert Walsh when he was just a young Special Forces captain. Hello, Robert. It's Margaret Blackwood. I believe we need to discuss some unwelcome visitors to the museum. There was a pause, then Walsh's voice softened with recognition and respect. Mrs. Blackwood, it's been too long. Tell me everything. As Margaret began explaining the situation, she watched another unfamiliar vehicle join the SUV, maintaining professional surveillance spacing. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old widow. They were about to learn why the Special Forces community took care of its own. The sound of rotors thudding in the distance caught her attention. Right on schedule, a group of Special Forces trainees from Fort Bayard was arriving for their weekly visit to the museum. Margaret smiled, remembering James's words about the best plans being the ones already in motion before your opponent knows. They're needed. The Cartel's surveillance teams were about to get their first lesson in why you don't threaten the widow of a Special Forces legend. Margaret had spent 60 years supporting men who specialized in impossible missions. Now it was time to show these criminals why that experience was more valuable than any amount of intimidation. Margaret's conversation with Director Walsh lasted precisely 12 minutes, but its impact would soon ripple through the mountain community. As she set down the phone, her keen eyes caught movement at the museum's entrance. Another group of visitors arriving, their military bearing evident in their measured steps and alert postures. Among them, she recognized Captain Sarah Martinez, one of the Special Forces instructors from Fort Bayard, who frequently brought trainees to study the museum's collection. The dark SUV that had been monitoring the property suddenly accelerated. Its driver clearly unsettled by the arrival of obvious military personnel. Margaret allowed herself a small smile, remembering James's lessons about psychological warfare. Sometimes the mere suggestion of strength was more effective than its actual display. Captain Martinez separated from her group, making her way to the porch while her trainees filed into the museum. "Mrs. Blackwood," she called out, climbing the weathered steps, "we noticed some unusual activity on our way in." "Just some aspiring real estate developers," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a hint of irony. "They seem very interested in the property's strategic location." Sarah's expression hardened. She'd spent enough time with Margaret to recognize the subtle warnings in her words. Real estate developers don't usually employ counter-surveillance techniques or maintain tactical spacing in their vehicles. Margaret gestured to the empty rocking chair, an invitation Sarah accepted with military precision. "You've noticed our visitors' professional behavior, then?" "Hard to miss. They're running textbook patterns, but their discipline suggests private military training rather than standard cartel tactics." Sarah's eyes continuously scanned the surrounding ridgelines as she spoke. "We've been monitoring increased activity in the region. Fort Bayard's intelligence section has noted a significant uptick in former military contractors moving through the area." The sound of another vehicle approaching drew their attention. This time, it was a weathered pickup truck belonging to Daniel Cooper, one of the local ranchers who'd served with James in Vietnam. His arrival was no coincidence. Margaret's call to Director Walsh had set multiple wheels in motion. "Peggy!" Daniel called out as he climbed from his truck, his lean frame still carrying the alertness of a combat veteran, despite his 70-plus years. "Thought I'd stop by, maybe take a look at that new display you mentioned." Margaret's eyes crinkled with knowing appreciation. There was no new display. This was the response system James had helped establish before his passing, a network of veterans ready to support each other when needed. "Of course, Dan. Sarah and I were just discussing some recent visitors to the area." Daniel took up a casual position that gave him clear views of both approach roads. "Noticed them myself. Very professional outfit, too professional for simple drug runners." Sarah nodded in agreement. "They're building something bigger. The cartel's traditional tactics are changing. They're incorporating advanced military techniques. Using veterans as trainers and enforcers, Margaret reached for her ever-present notebook, making a show of recording visitor statistics while actually noting the patrol patterns of the surveillance vehicles. James always said that when an enemy changes tactics, they're either desperate or preparing for something significant. Both, in this case, Daniel replied, his voice low. Word among the ranchers is they're not just moving product anymore. They're establishing permanent infrastructure, using legitimate businesses as cover. Your museum's location makes it an ideal command and control center. Sarah finished. These passes have limited access points, clear lines of sight. Perfect for monitoring movement through the region. A distant engine sound caught their attention. Another SUV, this one moving with the same professional precision as the others. Margaret watched it through eyes trained by decades of marriage to a man who taught her to recognize threats before they fully materialized. They'll make their move soon, she said quietly. They've studied the property, assessed routines. They think they're dealing with a simple widow running a small museum. Daniel's hand unconsciously moved to where he'd once carried a service weapon. They don't know about the network, about what James helped build here. Sarah straightened in her chair, her training evident in her posture. Ma'am, I can arrange for additional security. Fort Bayard could... Margaret held up a hand, stopping. No, Captain, we do this James's way. Let them think they have the advantage. Let them make the mistake of underestimating what a military widow knows about tactical response. The sound of boots on wooden steps announced the arrival of Mike Torres' son Jake, now a deputy following in his father's footsteps. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying the same respect his father showed. Dad asked me to check in. We've identified some of the vehicles. They're registered to shell companies known to work with the Sinaloa Cartel. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. And their pattern suggests they're planning something beyond simple intimidation. They've been approaching local businesses, Jake confirmed, offering protection, demanding cooperation. But this feels different. They're putting too much resources into surveilling your property. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Because they want the museum itself, its location, its legitimacy as a cover operation. They're not here to extort money. They're here to take control. Just like James predicted, Margaret said softly, drawing surprised looks from her visitors. He always said if someone wanted to move significant resources through these mountains, they'd need more than just smuggling routes. They'd need legitimate businesses, respected community fixtures to hide behind. Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping. That's why he helped establish the Veterans Network. Why he made sure you had connections to every major military installation in the region. Margaret smiled, remembering long conversations with James about contingency planning. My husband spent his life preparing for worst-case scenarios. He made sure I was ready to face them without him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as Margaret shared her observations about the cartel's surveillance patterns. Each person present represented a different aspect of the response network James had helped create. Law enforcement, military, local veterans, all connected through years of shared service and mutual support. They'll test our response first, Sarah said, her tactical training evident in her analysis. Probably start with subtle pressure, gauge our reaction before committing to a direct move. Jake nodded in agreement. Standard escalation pattern. They've been using it across the county, but they've never tried to take over something like this, a museum with direct military connections. Because they don't understand what those connections mean, Margaret replied. her voice carrying decades of experience supporting military operations. They see an old widow running a small museum. They don't see the network, the community, the bonds forged through years of service. Daniel shifted in his chair, his expression grim. They're not just dealing with a museum, they're challenging the entire military community. Every veteran who's ever visited here, every special forces team that's trained using these displays. Every operator who owns James a debt of gratitude, Sarah added. And there are many of those, aren't there, Mrs. Blackwood? Margaret reached for her phone as another surveillance vehicle made its pass. More than they could imagine, Captain, and thanks to Director Walsh, they're about to learn why you don't threaten a Special Forces widow. The group dispersed as naturally as they had gathered, each moving with the casual precision of those accustomed to operating under observation. To the cartel's surveillance teams, it would have appeared as nothing more than a typical day at a small military museum. They couldn't know that with each passing hour, an invisible network was activating, preparing to demonstrate why the military community protected its own. Margaret watched the sun setting behind the mountains, remembering countless evenings spent on this porch with James, planning for contingencies they hoped would never arise. The cartel thought they were dealing with an easy target, an elderly widow they could intimidate or overwhelm. They were about to learn why James had always said the most dangerous opponent was the one whose strength you couldn't see. As darkness fell, Margaret began her nightly routine, making a show of closing the museum and securing the property. To the watching eyes, she appeared to be nothing more than an old woman preparing for another quiet night. They couldn't know that her every movement was calculated, every action part of a plan set in motion by her call to Director Walsh. The cartel's surveillance teams maintained their professional distance, confident in their tactical advantage. But they had made a crucial mistake. They had failed to understand that in the military community, strength wasn't measured in weapons or manpower, but in the bonds forged through decades of shared service and sacrifice. Margaret smiled as she turned out the porch light, remembering James's favorite saying about tactical advantage: the best position is the one your enemy gives you by underestimating your capabilities. The cartel was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The first signs of the cartel's direct move came 3 days after Margaret's call to Director Walsh. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when a pristine black Mercedes pulled up to the museum's gate. 2 men in expensive suits emerged, their military bearing evident in their measured movements. Through her kitchen window, Margaret watched them approach the main entrance, noting their practiced scanning of potential threat angles. Definitely former special operations, likely American-trained. The older of the 2 men knocked on the door with calculated politeness. Margaret took her time answering, allowing them to stand exposed on the porch while hidden cameras recorded their every movement. When she finally opened the door, she presented the perfect picture of an elderly widow, floral dress, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Good morning, gentlemen. The museum doesn't open for another hour, but you seem eager to visit." The older man smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood, my name is Victor Reyes. My associate and I represent a private investment group interested in preserving historical sites like your wonderful museum." Margaret adjusted her glasses, studying them with the sharp attention she'd developed through decades of supporting covert operations. "How interesting. Please come in. I just made coffee." She led them into the kitchen, noting how they unconsciously checked corners and sightlines, definitely special operations trained. As she poured coffee with deliberately shaky hands, she activated the silent alert system James had installed. Years ago, in offices across 3 states, signals would now be alerting key members of the Veterans Network. "Your museum occupies a unique position, Mrs. Blackwood," Reyes said, declining the offered coffee. "Our organization believes it could benefit from professional security and modernized facilities." Margaret settled into her chair, playing the role of an eager elderly hostess. "Oh my, that sounds expensive. I run this place on a volunteer basis. You know, just trying to preserve my dear James's legacy." The younger man spoke for the first time, his accent betraying Colombian military training. "Our organization would handle all expenses. We simply require operational autonomy in managing the property." "You're very kind," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly. A performance honed through years of hosting military intelligence officers disguised as casual visitors. "But I should probably consult with some of James's old colleagues. They've been so helpful since his passing." Reyes's smile tightened. "With respect, Mrs. Blackwood, this offer is time-sensitive. We have similar arrangements with other properties in the region. Some of your neighbors have already agreed to our partnership." A vehicle passed on the main road. One of Mike Torres's deputy patrols, right on schedule. Margaret saw the minute tension in both men's shoulders at the sound. They were worried about law enforcement observation, which meant their plan wasn't ready for full implementation yet. "I'm just not sure," Margaret said, her voice wavering. "This place, it means so much to the military community. The special forces teams that train nearby, they visit so often." She caught the quick glance between the men at the mention of special forces. They hadn't known about that connection. "Good. Perhaps we could discuss this further tomorrow," Reyes suggested smoothly. "Give you time to consider our offer. Though I should mention, our organization prefers to work with cooperative partners. It would be unfortunate if anything happened to this wonderful collection." Margaret let her hands shake as she set down her coffee cup. "Are you threatening an old woman?" "Not at all," Reyes replied, standing. "Simply expressing our strong interest in preserving historical artifacts. We'll return tomorrow for your answer." As they left, Margaret noticed 3 more surveillance vehicles had taken up positions around the property. The cartel was escalating, just as Sarah had predicted. They wouldn't wait long after this initial approach. Margaret waited until the Mercedes was well clear before retrieving her secure phone. Director Walsh answered on the first ring. "They made contact," she reported, her voice now sharp and clear. "Former special operations, probably contracted through their usual channels. They're planning to use the museum as a command center." "Acknowledged," Walsh replied. "Our assets are in position. Let them think they have the advantage for now. We need to identify their entire network before we move." Margaret watched another cartel vehicle pass the property. "They'll act soon. This location is too valuable to their expansion plans." "Then we'll be ready," Walsh assured her. "The teams are eager to repay their debt to James. Just maintain your cover a little longer." After ending the call, Margaret began her daily routine of opening the museum. To the watching surveillance teams, she appeared to be a shaken elderly woman, going through familiar motions. They couldn't see her cataloging their positions, noting their patrol patterns, building a comprehensive picture of their operational structure. The morning brought a steady stream of visitors to the museum. Margaret noticed how the cartel's observers paid special attention to those with military bearing, photographing vehicles and faces. They were mapping her support network, not realizing they were actually revealing their own surveillance capabilities. Around noon, Sarah Martinez arrived with another group of Special Forces trainees. As the young operators toured the displays, Sarah made her way to Margaret's office. "We've identified their primary observation posts," she reported quietly. "They're using former Delta Force contractors as security consultants. Very professional." "Set up?" Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "They want this location badly. The museum's reputation provides perfect cover for moving personnel and resources through the region." "They won't wait long after their initial contact," Sarah warned. "Standard cartel procedure is to demonstrate force within 48 hours if the target shows hesitation." "I'm counting on it," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the same steel that had supported James through countless dangerous operations. "Let them think their show of force will frighten an old woman. They'll never expect the response they're about to trigger." Throughout the afternoon, Margaret maintained her appearance of nervous uncertainty. When Mike Torres stopped by to check on her, she made sure the cartel's observers saw her anxious gestures and worried expression. To their surveillance, it would appear the sheriff was trying to reassure a frightened elderly woman. In reality, she was passing crucial intelligence about the cartel's local network. The supposedly casual conversations with visitors throughout the day were actually updating key players about surveillance positions, patrol patterns, and operational procedures. As evening approached, Margaret received another call from Director Walsh. "Our teams have identified their primary command center," he reported. "They're running the entire regional operation from a compound just across the Mexican border. Very sophisticated setup." "James always said the cartels would eventually try to militarize their operations," Margaret replied, watching another surveillance vehicle pass. "He predicted they'd start recruiting special operations contractors to professionalize their infrastructure." "Your husband's foresight is still saving lives," Walsh said, his voice carrying deep respect. "The network he helped build, it's going to shut down their entire regional operation." Margaret smiled, remembering long conversations with James about the importance of preparation. "They think they're dealing with a museum director. They don't realize they're threatening a memorial to one of the most connected Special Forces commanders in history." The sun was setting when Margaret spotted vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The cartel preparing for their show of force, right on schedule. "They're moving into position," she reported to Walsh. "At least 8 vehicles, all with tactical teams." "Good," Walsh replied. "Our assets are in place. Remember, let them think they have complete tactical advantage. The more confidence they show, the more of their network they'll expose." Margaret began her evening routine, making sure the cartel's observers saw her nervous glances at their gathering forces. To them, she appeared to be a frightened old woman realizing the severity of her situation. They couldn't know that every trembling movement was actually cataloging their positions, every fearful glance recording their tactical arrangements. As darkness fell, the cartel's forces continued to gather. Margaret counted at least 20 operators taking up positions around the property. Their movements showed extensive military training. These weren't ordinary cartel soldiers, but highly paid contractors executing a professional operation. Inside, the museum hidden systems recorded their communications, mapped their deployment patterns, and transmitted real-time intelligence to multiple federal agencies. The cartel thought they were preparing to intimidate an elderly widow. In reality, they were walking into one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations ever conceived by Special Forces Command. Margaret allowed herself a small smile as she watched their final preparations. James had always said the best trap was the one your enemy walked into willingly, believing they held every advantage. Tomorrow, the cartel would learn why you never threaten the widow of a Special Forces legend. More importantly, they would discover that in the world of covert operations, the most dangerous weapon wasn't force or intimidation. It was the invisible network of loyalty and obligation built through decades of shared sacrifice. The cartel's show of force began at precisely 2 a.m., just as Margaret had predicted based on their previous patterns. 6 black SUVs converged on the museum property, their tactical teams deploying. With professional precision, through her bedroom window, she watched Victor Reyes emerge from the lead vehicle, now dressed in tactical gear rather than his expensive suit. Margaret activated the hidden surveillance system with a small remote. James had designed to look like a medical alert pendant. Across the property, concealed cameras began transmitting high-resolution footage to multiple secure locations. She counted 32 operators taking up positions around the museum, far more force than necessary to intimidate an elderly widow. The sound of boots on her front porch was followed by a sharp knock. "Mrs. Blackwood," Reyes called out, his voice carrying artificial concern. "We need to discuss your situation urgently." Margaret took her time responding, letting them stew in the pre-dawn darkness. When she finally opened the door, she wore a nightgown and showed calculated fear in her expression. "Mr. Reyes, what's happening? All these men—" "Insurance, Mrs. Blackwood," Reyes replied smoothly. "Our organization takes the protection of historical artifacts very seriously. We've received credible threats against properties in this region." Behind him, Margaret noted how the tactical teams maintained professional spacing, their weapons held in ready positions. Their gear was top-tier military equipment. Someone was investing heavily in this operation. "Threats?" Margaret's voice quavered perfectly. "Should I call the sheriff?" "That won't be necessary," Reyes said, stepping closer. "Our security teams are more than capable of handling any situation. However, we need operational control of the property immediately. For your own safety, of course." A noise from the ridge caught their attention. Someone moving in the darkness. Margaret saw Reyes's men tense, their training evident in their immediate tactical response. But the movement wasn't hostile. It was exactly what she'd been waiting. "You have visitors, Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. "Quite a few of them, I believe." Reyes spun around as multiple laser sights appeared on his tactical gear. From the darkness emerged dozens of figures. Special Forces operators moving with the silent precision that had made them legends in the covert operations community. "Federal agents!" a commanding voice called out. "Everyone on the ground now!" The cartel's contractors hesitated, their training warring with their situation. They held superior numbers, but the quality of their opposition was immediately clear. To anyone with combat experience, "Stand down," Margaret advised quietly. "You're surrounded by the best special operations teams in the world. Men who owe their lives to my husband's training. Did you really think James wouldn't ensure his memorial was protected?" Reyes's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as more operators emerged from the darkness. His tactical teams were now covered from every angle, caught in interlocking fields of fire from operators who had perfected these techniques over decades of covert missions. "This is impossible," Reyes muttered. "Our intelligence, you were just a widow running a museum." Margaret smiled, decades of supporting covert operations evident in her poised demeanor. "I'm not just a widow, Mr. Reyes. I'm the keeper of my husband's legacy. Did you bother researching who James Blackwood was before you threatened his museum?" Director Walsh stepped from the shadows, his presence confirming the operation's significance. Colonel Blackwood trained 3 generations of special forces, operators. Every man here either served with him, learned from him, or owes their life to his techniques. The cartel's contractors were professionals. They recognized when a situation was unsalvageable. One by one, they lowered their weapons, their surrender executed with the same precision as their arrival. The museum's historical records, Reyes said, understanding finally dawning. "They're not just artifacts. They're a cover," Margaret finished. "Every special forces team that visits, every veteran who tours the displays, they're maintaining an active network. James didn't just leave me a museum, Mr. Reyes. He left me the loyalty of the most elite warriors in history." Sarah Martinez emerged from the darkness, leading a team of operators who began securing the cartel's vehicles. "Mrs. Blackwood has been documenting your entire operation, every surveillance position, every patrol pattern, every communication frequency. We've identified your entire regional network," Director Walsh added. "Shell companies, front businesses, compromised officials. Your organization's attempt to militarize operations in this region is finished." Margaret watched as federal agents began arriving, their vehicles moving with deliberate quiet to maintain operational security. The night's events would never make the news. The best operations were the ones the public never knew about. "Your mistake," she told Reyes as agents took him into custody, "was assuming an elderly widow would be an easy target. You should have asked why a special forces legend chose this location for his memorial." Throughout the property, federal teams were gathering evidence from the cartel's vehicles. Margaret's detailed intelligence had given them everything they needed to dismantle the organization's entire regional infrastructure. "Director," she called out as Walsh supervised the operation, "don't forget to check the ridge south of the property. They've been using it as a command post for their surveillance teams." Walsh nodded, impressed but not surprised by her tactical awareness. "Already secured, ma'am. Your intelligence was perfect, as always." More vehicles arrived. Military transports rather than civilian law enforcement. Margaret recognized the insignia of multiple special operations units. The cartel's attempt to establish a militarized presence had drawn the full attention of the covert operations community. "They weren't just trying to take the museum," Sarah reported, joining Margaret on the porch. "This was meant to be their regional headquarters. Your location, your legitimate cover as a historical site." "James knew they'd try eventually," Margaret replied. "That's why he spent years preparing the response network. Every visitor log, every donation record, they're all part of an active intelligence database." Dawn was breaking as the last of the cartel's contractors were loaded into transport vehicles. Margaret watched federal teams sweeping the property with professional thoroughness, knowing they would find nothing she hadn't already documented. "Mom?" a young operator approached. his bearing marking him as one of the newer generation of special forces. Colonel Blackwood was my first instructor. Everything I know about covert operations, I learned from his training programs. Margaret smiled, recognizing the deeper meaning in his words. The museum will remain open, son. James believed in passing on knowledge to the next generation. That won't change. Director Walsh rejoined them, his expression satisfied. Initial. Reports confirm it. We've identified their entire command structure. Your intelligence gave us everything we needed to shut down their militarization program completely. Sarah's team had finished securing the museum grounds. No damage to any exhibits, she reported. They were so focused on their tactical advantage. They never realized they were walking into a prepared operation. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. James always said the best position is the one your enemy gives you by underestimating you. They saw an old woman living alone. They never considered why a special forces legend would leave his widow in charge of his memorial. The sun rose fully over the mountains, illuminating a scene that would never appear in any official report. Federal teams continued gathering evidence, while special operations units maintained security. To any casual observer, it would appear to be nothing more than an unusually busy morning at a small military museum. The network is active now, Walsh said quietly. Every Special Forces team in the region is on alert. No one will threaten this memorial again. Margaret watched the last of the cartel's vehicles being impounded. They thought they were dealing with a museum director. They never understood they were challenging the entire Special Forces community. As the federal teams began withdrawing, maintaining operational security, Margaret prepared to open the museum for its regular hours. To any visitors, it would appear to be just another day preserving military history. They would never know that. In the pre-dawn hours, the legacy of a Special Forces legend had reminded the cartel why you don't threaten a warrior's widow. The morning after the raid brought an eerie calm to the Blackwood Museum. Margaret maintained her normal routine, serving coffee to early visitors, while federal teams discreetly processed evidence from the night's operation. To casual observers, nothing seemed unusual about the elderly widow greeting guests with her trademark hospitality. Director Walsh had stationed plainclothes operators throughout the property, their presence invisible to anyone without tactical training. Through her kitchen window, Margaret watched them maintaining professional coverage while appearing to be ordinary tourists studying military displays. Sarah Martinez arrived as the sun cleared the mountains, her civilian clothes unable to completely mask her tactical readiness. "We've decoded their communications," she reported quietly while accepting a cup of coffee. "The cartel's leadership is having an emergency meeting across the border. They never expected this level of resistance." Margaret nodded, noting a familiar vehicle approaching the museum's entrance. "They'll respond dramatically. Organizations like that can't afford to appear weak." James always said the most dangerous moment is right after you've disrupted their plans. Daniel Cooper's weathered truck pulled up to the gate, the old veteran's arrival perfectly timed to maintain their cover of normal operations. He carried a box of what appeared to be military memorabilia, actually containing sophisticated surveillance equipment to replace what had been exposed during the night's operation. "Morning, Peggy," he called out with calculated casualness. "Found some. More of James's old equipment in my attic. Thought the museum might want it." "Always appreciated, Dan," Margaret replied, maintaining their practiced routine. "Sarah's here too. Why don't you show her what you've brought?" The three gathered in Margaret's office, away from curious eyes. Daniel's expression turned serious as he unpacked the surveillance gear, picked up increased chatter on the border. They're moving significant resources into the region, former special operations contractors, military-grade equipment. Sarah activated one of the new monitoring devices, its screen showing thermal images of the surrounding terrain. They're not just responding to a failed operation. This level of escalation suggests we interrupted something bigger. Margaret studied the thermal readings, noting multiple heat signatures in the hills beyond her property. They're already repositioning. These aren't just surveillance teams anymore. They're setting up for a major operation. Ma'am, Sarah's voice carried professional concern. Maybe we should consider relocating the museum temporarily, at least until we better understand their capabilities. Margaret's hand touched the silver locket she always wore, the one containing a photo of James in his Special Forces uniform. This museum isn't just a building, Captain. It's a symbol of everything the Special Forces community stands for. If we abandon it now, we are telling them that intimidation works. Daniel nodded in agreement, his Vietnam-era training evident in how he positioned himself to watch both entrance points. Besides, the network is active now. Every veteran within 500 miles is on alert. They may have military contractors, but we have something they can't buy: genuine loyalty. The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through the security monitors, they watched 3 unmarked SUVs park at discrete intervals along the road. Their drivers maintained professional spacing, definitely military trained. They're being less subtle now, Sarah observed, noting their tactical positioning. These aren't cartel soldiers trying to appear professional. These are legitimate operators working for the cartels. Margaret activated another of Daniel's surveillance devices, this one monitoring radio frequencies. They're using military-grade encryption, but their pattern is familiar. James documented similar techniques during operations against drug lords, who'd hired private military contractors. A burst of static from the radio preceded a voice speaking rapid Spanish. Sarah translated quietly. They're coordinating with teams across the border, multiple units moving into position. This isn't just about the museum anymore. They're accelerating their entire regional operation. Because we forced their hand, Margaret replied, her voice carrying decades of experience supporting covert operations. They can't risk losing their momentum. The museum was supposed to be their command center for expanding north. Now they'll have to move before they're fully prepared. Daniel's expression darkened as he studied the thermal imaging. More teams entering the area. They're establishing a perimeter beyond standard surveillance range. Professional containment. Protocol. The museum's front door chimed as Mike Torres entered, his sheriff's uniform concealing tactical gear. Just got word from Border Patrol, he reported, joining them in the office. Major movement at all the crossing points. They're bringing in serious equipment, the kind you don't use for simple drug running. Margaret watched another SUV take up position, its crew maintaining perfect tactical awareness. They're not just moving drugs anymore. This level of militarization, the professional contractors, the sophisticated equipment, they're building infrastructure for something bigger. Sarah's radio crackled with encoded transmissions, multiple teams coordinating. They're using former Delta Force protocols. Someone very experienced is running their tactical operations. Director Walsh is monitoring from Fort Bayard, Mike added. He's seeing similar patterns across the region. Every cartel-connected business is suddenly upgrading security, bringing in professional operators. Margaret's mind raced, connecting patterns just as James had taught her through years of marriage to a Special Forces commander. They're not just responding to us stopping their takeover, they're using this as an excuse to accelerate their entire operation. Daniel moved to the window, his veteran's instincts noting every tactical position. The museum was supposed to be their test run. See if they could establish legitimate cover operations using military contractors. Now they're skipping the subtlety. The radio intercepted another burst of encrypted communication. Sarah's expression hardened as she translated. They're calling in additional teams, professional operators, not cartel soldiers. They're treating this like a military operation now. Margaret activated the museum's enhanced security protocols, systems James had installed years ago, designed to counter professional military threats. They think overwhelming force will succeed where subtlety failed. They still don't understand what they're really fighting. Mike's radio crackled with updates from his deputies. Similar activity at other strategic locations throughout the county. They're setting up multiple command posts, all staffed with military contractors. Because they've exposed their hand, Margaret said, watching another tactical team take up position. They can't risk appearing weak now. Instead of hiding their militarization, they're going to demonstrate it. Make an example of anyone who resists. Sarah studied the tactical deployments with professional appreciation. These aren't random contractors anymore. Their positioning, their coordination, they've brought in serious operators, people who've run major military operations. All the more reason to stand our ground, Margaret replied, her voice carrying the same steel that had supported James through countless dangerous missions. They want to show their military capabilities? Fine. Let's show them why experience and loyalty matter more than expensive contractors. The museum's visitor alert chimed again. Through the security feed, they watched a group of apparent tourists enter, their military bearing visible to trained eyes. More of Walsh's operators maintaining their cover while establishing defensive positions. They'll move soon, Daniel predicted, recognizing the tactical buildup. Probably wait for darkness, use their night operations capability, make a show of their professional training. Margaret nodded, remembering similar patterns from operations James had commanded. They think military contractors give them the advantage. They don't understand that real strength comes from the bonds forged through years of shared service. Mike's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Federal task force is tracking increased activity at their border compounds. Major equipment movement. Professional operators arriving hourly. Let them come, Margaret said quietly, touching the locket containing James's photo. Let them bring their contractors and their military equipment. They're about to learn why the Special Forces community takes care of its own. Outside, the cartel's teams continued their tactical deployment, their professionalism evident in every movement. They thought they were preparing to overwhelm an elderly widow's resistance. They couldn't know they were actually revealing their entire operational structure to some of the most experienced covert operators in history. The sun climbed higher as Margaret maintained her cover of normal museum operations, greeting visitors while monitoring the enemy's buildup. To their surveillance, she appeared to be nothing more than a dedicated widow preserving her husband's legacy. They would never understand that in challenging her museum, they had activated a network of loyalty that no amount of money could buy. As dusk approached, the cartel's military contractors began their coordinated advance on the Blackwood Museum. Their movement revealed extensive special operations training, each team maintaining perfect tactical spacing as they established interlocking fields of fire around the property. Through hidden cameras, Margaret watched their methodical deployment while calmly pouring her evening tea. The museum's surveillance systems tracked 26 professional operators taking up positions, their equipment indicating serious financial investment. These weren't ordinary cartel soldiers playing at military tactics. These were experienced special operations veterans executing a precision operation. They're using modified Delta Force protocols, Sarah Martinez observed from her concealed position in the museum's research room. Multiple containment teams, professional communications discipline, someone with serious experience is coordinating this. Margaret sipped her tea, noting how the tactical teams maintained deliberate visibility. They want us to see their capabilities. This isn't just about taking the museum anymore. It's a demonstration of force for the entire region. Director Walsh's voice crackled through their secure radio. Intercepted communications confirm it. They're streaming this operation to multiple cartel compounds. It's meant to showcase their new military capabilities. Through the kitchen window, Margaret spotted Victor Reyes emerging from an armored SUV, now dressed in full tactical gear. The failed intimidation attempt had clearly wounded his pride. He was determined to prove his organization's strength. Mrs. Blackwood, his voice carried across the darkening grounds, I trust you've reconsidered our generous offer. As you can. See, we have significant resources dedicated to protecting historical sites like yours. Margaret activated her hidden microphone, allowing her response to be recorded by multiple intelligence agencies. Your resources are impressive, Mr. Reyes, though I notice your contractors seem more suited to assault than preservation. A harsh laugh echoed from the darkness. Still maintaining the facade of a simple museum? We know this place is more than that. The location, the security systems, the military connections. Colonel Blackwood built something far more valuable than a memorial. You're right about that, Margaret replied calmly, though not in the way you imagine. More tactical teams emerged from the shadows, their movement betraying extensive military experience. Margaret counted at least 40 operators now, far more force than necessary for taking a small museum. Final warning, Reyes called out. Surrender control of the facility or we demonstrate our full capabilities. Your federal friends can't respond in time to save your precious artifacts. Sarah's voice whispered through their tactical radio. Multiple teams moving to breach positions. They're serious about this demonstration. Good, Margaret responded quietly. Let them commit fully to the operation. Director Walsh needs to document their entire tactical capability. The sound of helicopters approaching drew everyone's attention. 3 black military-style aircraft appeared over the mountains, their arrival clearly intended to intimidate. Impressive equipment, Margaret commented, her voice carrying clearly across the grounds. Though James always said the best operators didn't need to make a show of their capabilities. Reyes gestured, and his tactical teams began their final approach. Their movement was professional, coordinated, exactly what you'd expect from special operations contractors executing a prepared assault. You had your chance to cooperate, he called out. Now we'll show everyone why resistance against our organization is futile. Margaret smiled, touching the silver locket containing James's photo. Actually, Mr. Reyes, you're about to demonstrate something entirely different. The night erupted with coordinated action as dozens of hidden operators revealed their positions. Elite warriors who had trained under Colonel Blackwood emerged from concealed locations, their years of actual combat experience evident in their precise response. "Federal agents!" Director Walsh's voice boomed from multiple directions. "All enemy personnel are surrounded and targeted. Stand down immediately." Reyes's tactical teams froze, their professional training allowing them to instantly recognize the quality of their opposition. They found themselves caught in interlocking fields of fire from operators who had perfected these techniques in real combat. "Impossible," Reyes muttered, watching his careful plan dissolve. "Our intelligence confirmed no federal presence in the region." Margaret's voice carried clearly through the chaos. "Your intelligence was monitoring recent activity. James spent decades building this network. Every Special Forces team that visited, every veteran who toured the displays, they were maintaining active connections." Sarah emerged from her hidden position, leading a team of operators who began systematically disarming the cartel's contractors. "Did you really think Colonel Blackwood would leave his memorial unprotected? That he wouldn't prepare for exactly this kind of threat?" The cartel's helicopters suddenly found themselves painted by laser targeting systems from multiple directions. The pilots, recognizing the futility of resistance, began immediate landing procedures. "Impressive equipment," Margaret commented to Reyes as federal agents took him into custody. But James always said the most powerful weapon in special operations wasn't technology. It was the loyalty earned through years of shared combat. Director Walsh strode from the darkness, his presence confirming the operation's significance. "Your organization's attempt to militarize operations in this region is finished. We've identified every contractor, every supply line, every compromised official." Margaret watched federal teams securing the cartel's vehicles and equipment. "You thought you were targeting a widow's museum, Mr. Reyes. Instead, you exposed your entire tactical infrastructure to the most experienced covert operators in history." Sarah's team had begun gathering evidence from the captured contractors. "Multiple agencies monitoring," she reported. "Every cartel compound that was watching your demonstration just witnessed their entire militarization program collapse." The sound of more vehicles approaching drew their attention, military transports rather than tactical units. Margaret recognized the insignia of elite special operations teams arriving to secure the scene. "Your contractors are professionals," Walsh commented to Reyes. "They'll understand they were defeated by superior experience, not superior numbers. That's a message that will spread through their entire community." Margaret surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The cartel's attempt to demonstrate their military capabilities had instead revealed the true power of the Special Forces network. Bonds forged through decades of shared sacrifice that no amount of money could buy. "You relied on paid contractors," she told Reyes as agents led him away. "We rely on warriors who trained under my husband, who owe their lives to his leadership. That's why you never had a chance." Throughout the property, federal teams continued gathering evidence of the cartel's militarization program. The sophisticated equipment, the professional operators, the tactical protocols, everything pointed to a massive investment in building illegal military capabilities. "Initial reports confirm it," Walsh reported, joining Margaret on the porch. "Their entire regional command structure is exposed. Your husband's network just dismantled their most ambitious operation to date." Sarah coordinated with arriving federal units, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly documented. They thought overwhelming force would guarantee victory, They never understood that in special operations, experience and loyalty matter more than equipment. The night's events would never appear in any official record. The best operations were the ones the public never knew about. But throughout the covert operations community, word would spread about how an elderly widow's museum had defeated the cartel's most sophisticated military contractors. James always said the best position was the one your enemy gave you by underestimating you, Margaret commented, watching federal teams process the scene. They saw an old woman running a memorial. They never considered why a Special Forces legend would entrust his legacy to someone who understood exactly how to protect it. As the last of the cartel's contractors were loaded into transport vehicles, Margaret prepared to return the museum to its normal routine. To any visitors tomorrow, it would appear to be just another day preserving military history. They would never know that in the darkness, the true power of the Special Forces community had reminded everyone why you don't threaten a warrior's widow. The morning sun revealed a scene of quiet activity at the Blackwood Museum. To passers-by, it appeared to be business as usual. Early visitors gathering for tours, staff preparing exhibits. Only those with keen eyes would notice the discreet presence of federal agents posing as tourists or spot the concealed security cameras tracking every approach. In her office, Margaret reviewed overnight reports from agencies across the country. The cartel's failed assault had exposed criminal networks from the border to the capital, corrupt officials, compromised businesses, illicit supply lines. The entire infrastructure of their militarization program laid bare by a single botched operation against a supposedly soft target. They underestimated you. Margaret looked up to see Director Walsh in the doorway, a knowing smile on his weathered face. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to her as he took a seat. They underestimated James, she corrected, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. He's the one who built this place into something more than a museum. I'm just the caretaker. Walsh shook his head. You're much more than that, and you know it. James left you this responsibility because he knew you'd understand how to leverage it. It's not just about preserving history, it's about maintaining readiness. Margaret sipped her coffee, savoring the rich aroma. Are you suggesting the museum has a role beyond education, Director? The corners of Walsh's eyes crinkled with amusement. I think we both know James had grander ambitions than collecting old uniforms. He wasn't just documenting the Special Forces legacy, he was extending it, building a network that could be called into action when the enemy revealed themselves. A smile played at Margaret's lips. And enemies always reveal themselves, don't they? Sooner or later they make the mistake of assuming a target is helpless. Hubris, Walsh nodded. The fatal flaw of men who believe their own power is unlimited. They see softness where there is flexibility, vulnerability where there is patience. The cartel thought they had modernized their operations to the point of invincibility, but they still fell prey to the most ancient weakness, pride. The same weakness James exploited on 100 covert missions, Margaret mused, allowing the enemy to fill in their own assumptions about his capabilities, then turning their preconceptions against them. For all their money and equipment, the cartel still has the mentality of street thugs, unable to imagine hidden strengths. Walsh finished his coffee, setting the empty cup on the desk. Hidden strengths and unexpected allies. Did they really think James would have left this place undefended? that the Special Forces community wouldn't maintain active connections with their own living heritage. Margaret glanced at the framed photo on her desk. James in his ceremonial uniform, surrounded by the men he'd led into countless battles. Men who owed their lives and their legacies to his vision. They expected to find a vulnerable old woman guarding a few dusty relics, she said softly. Instead, they found a network forged through decades of shared service, bonds that transcend retirement or official status. The true strength of special operations, human connection, and uncommon expertise. A strength you deployed masterfully. Walsh leaned forward, his expression sharpening. Speaking of deployments, we intercepted some interesting chatter overnight. It seems the failure of their ground assault has spurred the cartel to even greater escalation. They're accelerating plans to move high-value personnel and resources through the region, likely trying to salvage their operations before the net closes in completely. Margaret stood, moving to the large map mounted on her office wall. It was marked with countless pins and notes, cryptic symbols decipherable only to those trained in covert network analysis. Accelerated plans require hasty coordination, she observed, tracing lines between seemingly unrelated points. They'll need to balance speed with secrecy, use intermediaries to conceal the true nature of their movements. That requires trust, something they'll be in short supply of after last night's disaster. Walsh joined her at the map, his experienced eyes following her deductions. You suspect they'll make more mistakes, expose more of their network attempting damage control. Undoubtedly. Margaret's finger landed on a cluster of unassuming businesses near a major highway junction. They'll fall back on established methods first, overland transport along trusted routes. But their ground force superiority is broken, and they know it. They'll need alternate means to ensure security. Air transport using their front companies, possibly even local airports, with compromised officials. Our joint task force can increase scrutiny on those channels, Walsh said, pulling out his phone. Discreet surveillance to avoid triggering a full dispersal, at least until we've identified all the rats fleeing the sinking ship. Margaret nodded. Let them think their secrets are still safe. The more confident they are, the more operational details they'll expose as they rush to contain the damage. She paused, a wry smile touching her lips. James used to call it encouraging the enemy to reinvest in their own failure. Let them pour resources and planning into an escape route that's already compromised. Walsh returned her smile, already coordinating with multiple agencies through encrypted messages. Remind me never to play chess against you. I suspect you're as formidable across the board as you are in the field. James and I played regularly, Margaret replied, her eyes distant with memory. He said it kept our strategic instincts sharp. Of course, he had the advantage of applying those lessons on active missions while I was limited to more domestic battlefields. I wouldn't call staring down a cartel death squad domestic, Walsh countered, or single-handedly coordinating a response network that's made federal agencies green with envy. The fact that you did it without ever leaving the museum grounds is a testament to the strategic acumen James recognized in you. Margaret waved off the praise. I merely provided the groundwork. It was the agents in the field, the observers planted in local businesses, the intelligence analysts tracking communications. They're the ones who deserve credit. I'm just an old woman who knows how to brew a good pot of coffee and keep military secrets. Walsh accepted the deflection gracefully, understanding the deeper modesty beneath her words. An old woman who just dealt the most sophisticated criminal organization in the hemisphere a blow they won't soon forget. An organization that, need I remind you, thought they could expand their empire with impunity thanks to a few ex-military thugs on their payroll. Thugs chasing legends, Margaret scoffed. They thought buying some retired operators was all it took to make them formidable. They learned the hard way that real power comes from uncommon expertise and human connection, things that can't be purchased or faked. Their military contractors broke at the first sign of serious resistance because their loyalty was based on profit, not true partnership. She gestured to the photos lining her office walls. James with his men on missions across the globe, their bond evident even in faded snapshots. Special operators aren't just elite warriors. They're brothers forged by shared experience, united by an unbreakable code of honor. That kind of loyalty can't be bought or intimidated, and it doesn't end when the uniform comes off. A loyalty you've earned in your own right, Walsh said solemnly. I lost count of how many active and retired operators volunteered to defend this place when word spread of the cartel's plans. Men who hadn't worked together in decades fell into seamless coordination as soon as they got the call, because they knew it came from you. Margaret busied herself straightening a stack of papers on her desk, uncomfortable with the open praise. They came because it's what James would have done. Because he built this place as a living monument to our shared values. And they won't let it be tarnished by petty criminals playing at soldiers. They came for you, Margaret. Walsh's voice was gentle but insistent. Because you've been the heartbeat of the special operations community since the day you married James. The den mother who kept the home fires burning while they were deployed. The voice of experience guiding their decisions, even if it was just advice over a cup of coffee at this desk. Never underestimate the impact you've had or the respect you've earned. Margaret met his eyes, seeing the earnest sincerity beneath his professional facade. In that moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her own accomplishments, not just as James's widow, but as a woman whose strength and intelligence had shaped the course of countless covert operations. Then let's not keep them waiting, she said crisply. All business once again. We have a cartel to dismantle and a community to defend. James left us the tools and the talent. It's our responsibility to carry on his work. Walsh straightened, recognizing the subtle command in her tone. I'll coordinate with our federal partners to monitor all transit points. The increased security posture alone should force their hand, make them commit to an exfiltration route sooner rather than later. Good. Margaret turned back to the map, her eyes hardening as she studied the web of criminal enterprises they'd spent decades unraveling. Let them run. Let them scramble and scurry like the frightened vermin they are. They'll lead us right to their doorstep. She smiled coldly, a predator scenting blood. And when they get there expecting sanctuary, we'll be waiting with the full might of the Special Operations Brotherhood to teach them the true cost of hubris. As Walsh took his leave to coordinate the national response, Margaret allowed her fingers to trace the photo of James one last time. The cartel thought his death had left a vacuum, a weakness they could exploit. They were about to learn that his legacy was a living force, carried in the hearts and minds of the warriors he'd trained. A force that, when summoned to action by the woman who'd stood by his side through every battle, was more powerful than any criminal army. Let them come, she thought, her jaw set with grim determination. Let them throw their mercenaries and their drug money against the fortress James built. In the end, they'd fall just like every other enemy who dared to challenge the legend of the Green Berets. Not to superior firepower, but to the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood and the strategic brilliance of the woman who dedicated her life to preserving their legacy. The Blackwood Museum wasn't just a building. It was a living monument to the warrior spirit, and Margaret was its most formidable guardian. Heaven help anyone foolish enough to challenge her on the battlefield she knew best, the human terrain of covert operations. As she prepared to open the museum for another day, educating the public, Margaret couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation for the battles to come. The cartel thought they were the future of crime, professional, modernized, invincible. She would take great pleasure in teaching them about the past and the timeless power of human connection and uncommon expertise. A power she and James had spent their lives cultivating, and one she knew would triumph over any technological advantage. After all, what were a few mercenaries and smugglers against the combined might of the special operations community? Amateurs chasing legends, about to learn the true meaning of strength from a master of the craft. Margaret smiled to herself as she brewed another pot of coffee, the scent mingling with the familiar traces of gun oil and old leather that always seemed to linger in her office. The cartel had no idea what they'd started by challenging her, but they were about to find out, and she had a feeling the lesson would be one for the history books. Just the way James would have wanted it. Let the games begin. As the sun climbed higher over the Sierra County mountains, Margaret found herself once again in the museum's hidden communications room, surrounded by the latest surveillance technology and a team of elite intelligence analysts. The room hummed with quiet activity as they monitored the cartel's desperate attempts to salvage their crumbling operation. Mariposa Shipping has diverted 3 of their freight trucks from their usual routes, reported Elena, a young data specialist with a keen eye for pattern recognition. They're headed towards a small airstrip outside La Cruces, registered to a known cartel front company. Margaret nodded, tracing the truck's movement on the large digital map dominating the room's central wall. They're trying to conceal their cargo by mixing it with legitimate shipments. Clever, but predictable. Any activity at the airstrip? Increased ground traffic and refueling, but no flights yet, replied Jack, a veteran signals intelligence operator. They're likely waiting for the trucks to arrive before risking air transport. Harder to intercept once the cargo is airborne. Then we make sure it never leaves the ground, Margaret said decisively. Notify DEA and Customs. Have them establish discreet perimeter surveillance, but emphasize the need to avoid spooking our targets. We want them to feel safe enough to fully expose their network. The room burst into coordinated action as the team relayed Margaret's instructions through secure channels. She watched with quiet approval, marveling at how seamlessly James's legacy lived on through the dedicated professionals he'd recruited and trained. A soft chime from her phone drew Margaret's attention to an incoming encrypted message. Recognizing the sender, she excused herself to her office for privacy. "Go ahead, Sarah," she said, accepting the video call from the Special Forces liaison. Captain Martinez's face filled the screen, her expression a mix of determination and tightly controlled anger. "We found him, Mrs. Blackwood, the contractor coordinating the cartel's military operations. Former Delta Force, dishonorably discharged in 2012 for diverting government resources to support criminal activities. He's been off the grid for years, but the chatter we intercepted after the museum assault gave us a trail. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes intent. Bring me up to speed. Codename Lazarus, Sarah continued. Real name, Ethan Garrett. 45 years. Old served in Iraq and Afghanistan before being recruited into Delta. Expert in covert ops, unconventional warfare, and tactical planning. He was one of the best, which made his betrayal all the more shocking. The name stirred a faint memory in Margaret's mind, an echo of late-night conversations with James. Garrett. Wasn't he on the team for Operation Forsetti, the Colombian counter-drug mission in 2010? Sarah nodded grimly. He was the pointman. The operation was a success, but there were rumors about Garrett being a bit too friendly with the local cartels. Nothing concrete, until a CIA investigation found evidence of him selling classified intel and smuggling weapons through his military connections. He was arrested and court-martialed, but escaped custody before he could be sentenced. Went underground, and has been presumed dead for years, until now. Margaret's voice was cold. He's resurfaced to lead the cartel's mercenary army against us, against James's legacy. It gets worse, Sarah said. We've identified several other ex-military contractors working with Garrett. All of them disgraced former special operators. Men James helped train and lead. They've turned their skills against everything he stood for and aligned themselves with the very criminals he spent his life fighting. Margaret felt a hot flare of anger at the betrayal, at the insult to her husband's memory, but she kept her tone measured, channeling her outrage into icy determination. Then it's time we brought them to justice and showed the world what happens to those who spit on the sacrifice of true heroes. Sarah's answering smile held no warmth. I was hoping you'd say that. Delta's already mobilizing a containment team. These traitors are our mess to clean up, and we'll make damn sure they never tarnish the regiment's name again. Coordinate with a fine coup. Walsh, Margaret instructed. Integrate your team into the task force, but understand this isn't just a military operation. It's a battle for the soul of special operations, a reckoning for those who betrayed their oath. James always said that how we deal with our own fallen defines us more than how we confront the enemy. Understood, Sarah replied solemnly. We'll make this right for James, and for every operator who's ever worn the beret with honor. Lazarus and his band of mercenaries want to play the villain. We'll give them the full weight of Delta justice. As the call ended, Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. James's warnings about the dangers of special operators going rogue echoed in her memory, intertwined with the pain of learning one of his own former protégés was behind this. A current threat, but beneath the anger and sense of betrayal, a colder, clearer sense of purpose crystallized. This wasn't just about defending the museum anymore. It was about defending the very essence of what it meant to be a Green Beret, a warrior bound by honor and loyalty beyond personal gain. Lazarus and his followers had chosen to abandon those principles, to twist their skills into tools of criminal enterprise. In doing so, they declared war not just on the Blackwood Museum, but on the entire Special Operations Brotherhood. A war they were about to learn they were woefully unprepared for. Margaret stood, straightening her jacket with the same deliberate precision James had always shown before a critical mission. There was work to be done, a legacy to defend, and a band of disgraced traitors to bring to heel. She might be a widow, a curator, a gentle face offering coffee and war stories to awed recruits, But beneath it all, she was still the same iron-spined partner who'd stood by James's side through 1,000 covert battles. The shadows behind the legend, guarding his six and guiding his aim. Now, with her husband's memory under attack and his life's work threatened by those he'd once trusted, Margaret stepped fully into the light. No more the quiet supporter. She was the commander now. A legend in her own right, preparing to marshal the full might of the Special Operations world against an enemy that had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her. Let Lazarus and his mercenaries scheme and posture. Let them cling to their delusions of money and power, believing their faux military trappings made them formidable. They were about to face an army of real-life legends, led by a woman who'd spent decades absorbing strategy and tactics from the best unconventional warrior in American history. A woman who, beneath her gentle smiles and graying hair, possessed a mind like a steel trap and a will to match. Margaret allowed herself a moment to picture James beside her, his warm hand steady on her shoulders as he'd done so many times before. Critical operations. "Give 'em hell, Magpie," he'd say, using the nickname only he was allowed. "Show them what a Blackwood is made of." Then, with a soft sigh and a squaring of shoulders, Margaret opened the door and stepped out to face her destiny. And Lazarus's long overdue reckoning. It was time to teach a new generation of operators the true meaning of the Green Beret legacy. And heaven help any fool who thought they could stand in her way. The day progressed with deceptive calm at the Blackwood Museum, even as Margaret and her team worked furiously behind the scenes to coordinate the takedown of Lazarus and his mercenaries. Visitors came and went, marveling at the displays of military history, never suspecting the very real war being waged behind closed doors. Margaret moved through the exhibits with practiced grace, her smile warm and her voice steady as she regaled tourists with tales of James's exploits and the bravery of his fellow Green Berets. But her mind never strayed far from the developing operation or the looming confrontation with an enemy that had once been an ally. "Margaret, a word?" Mike Torres appeared at her elbow, his usual genial expression replaced with one of tightly controlled urgency. She followed him into a quiet alcove, noting the heightened security presence around the museum. "What have you got, Mike?" she asked, her voice low. The old sheriff glanced around, ensuring their privacy before replying. "Intercepted chatter from the airstrip. They're prepping a cargo plane for immediate departure, and our sources say Lazarus himself is on site to oversee the shipment. Looks like they're making their big move." Margaret digested the information, her mind racing. They're accelerating the timeline. Lazarus must suspect we're closing in, and he's desperate to salvage what he can of the operation. Mike nodded grimly. "Either that, or he's got an even bigger score lined up, something worth the risk of exposing himself." He paused, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Margaret, I know Delta's eager for payback, but we need to be smart about this. Lazarus isn't some two-bit cartel thug. He's a trained operator with skills and experience that match our best. If we spook him, we won't." Margaret's voice was hard, laced with a cold determination that sent a shiver down Mike's spine. "He may be skilled, but he's no James Blackwood. And more importantly, he doesn't have what we do. A network of the finest warriors and intel operatives in the world, united by a common purpose and an unbreakable bond." She met the sheriff's gaze, her eyes glinting with a ferocity he'd never seen before, the steel core beneath her gentle exterior forged in the fires of 1,000 covert operations. Lazarus and his ilk think loyalty can be bought, that honor is negotiable. We're going to show them just how wrong they are. With that, she turned on her heel and strode towards the communications room, Mike hurrying to keep pace. Inside, the team was a hive of activity, monitors flickering with real-time data feeds and tense voices trading rapid-fire updates. "Lazarus is on the move," Margaret announced, immediately commanding the room's attention. "We have one chance to take him down and dismantle his network, and that chance is now. I want eyes on every inch of that airstrip. No vehicle, no cargo, no person moves without us knowing." She turned to Elena, the young analyst's face alight with adrenaline and determination. "Coordinate with DEA and Customs. The moment that plane starts loading, I want a full tactical response ready to go. We take them by surprise, fast and hard, before they have a chance to raise the alarm." Jack, the veteran SIGINT operative, spoke up. "What about Lazarus? If he slips away during the chaos?" Margaret smiled coldly. "He won't, because he'll be too busy dealing with an entirely different threat, one he never saw coming." At their questioning looks, she elaborated, "Lazarus is arrogant, driven by ego and greed. He believes his past with Delta makes him untouchable, that his mercenary status puts him above consequence. It's time we disabused him of that notion." She turned to the secure video screen where Sarah Martinez's face waited, grim and resolute. "Captain, is your team in position?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied, her voice steady even through the crackle of encryption. "We have eyes on Lazarus. Just give the word." Margaret nodded, a fierce pride welling in her chest. "The word is given. Remind our rogue friend what it really means to be Delta and why betraying the Beret is a death sentence." As Sarah signed off to begin her operation, Margaret faced the room once more. "You all know your parts. It's time to end this, for James and for every warrior who paid the ultimate price, fighting scum like Lazarus and his cartel masters. Let's show them what happens when they dare to cross the Blackwood Museum, and the family who built it." A chorus of determined affirmatives rang out, each voice steeled with the cold resolve of professionals who'd long since mastered the art of controlled violence. Margaret felt a surge of fierce love and pride for these warriors, her adopted family bound by blood, sweat, and shared loss. With a last nod, she strode from the room, her bearing regal and her eyes alight with the promise of long-awaited justice. It was time to finish this, and heaven help any who stood in the way of Margaret Blackwood's vengeance. Miles away, oblivious to the gathering storm, Ethan Lazarus Garrett surveyed the organized chaos of the cartel airstrip with a sense of smug satisfaction. Men and equipment moved with practiced efficiency, loading pallets of weapons and contraband onto the waiting cargo plane. His plane, bought and paid for with the proceeds of criminal enterprise and the blood of the comrades he'd once sworn to serve. He allowed himself a moment to savor the irony. The great Delta Force, so proud and noble, reduced to chasing shadows, while their traitorous prodigal son ran circles around them. It had been child's play to leverage his old contacts, to twist the network James Blackwood had so painstakingly built into a tool for his new mercenary masters. A predator's smile curved Lazarus's lips as he watched another crate of stolen military hardware vanish into the plane's hold. It was almost too easy, like the universe itself was conspiring to reward his ruthlessness. He'd show them all what true power looked like, unfettered by morality or duty. Lazarus, risen from the ashes of a failed soldier to become a king in this new world of shadows and violence. And if James Blackwood's sainted widow and her band of toy soldiers thought they could stop him, well, he welcomed their best efforts. After all, it had been far too long since Lazarus had a chance to truly unleash his skills, to remind them all why he'd been the best of the best before they cast him out for daring to seize his own destiny. Let them come with all their righteous fury and misguided loyalty. Let noble Captain Martinez rally her precious Delta operators, dreaming of inglorious confrontation. He would bury them, just as he'd buried his past and risen anew, harder, colder, and infinitely more ruthless. They were still bound by rules and honor, while Lazarus had long since transcended such weakness, or so he believed, right up until the moment the first smoke grenade exploded at his feet and the full might of an avenging Delta force descended upon the airstrip like an army of ghosts given flesh and fury. Shots rang out, precise and lethal, cutting down cartel foot soldiers and traitorous mercenaries alike. Through the swirling chaos, a lone figure strode, captain's bars gleaming on, her collar, eyes hard as flint above a cold smile. "Ethan Garrett," Sarah Martinez called, her voice ringing with the authority of judgment long denied. "It's time you remembered what it means to wear the beret, and why betrayal is a sin that can never be forgiven." And as the rogue warrior, once called Lazarus, looked into the eyes of his reckoning, he suddenly understood the terrible truth. He hadn't escaped his past at all. He'd merely spent the intervening years digging his own grave, piling betrayal upon betrayal, until the weight of his sins dragged him down to a fate worse than any bullet. In that moment, as Sarah's team closed in and the last of his mercenary empire crumbled, Ethan Garrett finally grasped the lesson James Blackwood had tried to teach him all those years ago. That there was no true victory without honor, no lasting power without loyalty, and that a man who sold his soul for greed and ambition would forever be haunted by the ghosts of those he betrayed. Ghosts given voice and purpose by a widow with an iron will and a warrior's heart. Lazarus had risen from the grave of his own making, but as the cuffs snapped shut and the world faded to black, he knew that Margaret Blackwood would ensure he stayed buried, along with anyone else foolish enough to challenge the enduring legacy of a true Green Beret legend. In the aftermath of Lazarus's capture and the dismantling of his mercenary network, an eerie calm settled over the Sierra County mountains. The Blackwood Museum, once the focal point of a raging underworld battle, returned to its role as a quiet memorial to the sacrifices and triumphs of the Special Forces community. But for Margaret Blackwood, the work was far from over. Even as the dust settled and the immediate threat receded, she knew that the deeper war, the endless struggle against those who would pervert the principles of honor and service for their own gain, continued unabated. She sat in her office, poring over the latest intelligence reports from her network of allies and informants. The cartel, reeling from the loss of their mercenary army and the exposure of their infrastructure, had retreated to lick their wounds and regroup. But Margaret harbored no illusions that they would abandon their ambitions so easily. "They'll be back," she murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the well-worn edges of James's medal case. "Not today, maybe not even this year. But sooner or later, another Lazarus will rise, another lost soul seduced by the siren song of power. And greed." The sound of a gentle knock at the door roused Margaret from her contemplation. "Come in!" she called, straightening in her chair and smoothing the lines of her pristine uniform. Sarah Martinez entered, her bearing as crisp and professional as ever, despite the weariness that shadowed her eyes. The young Delta captain had been at the forefront of the operation to bring Lazarus to justice, and Margaret knew all too well the toll such missions could take on even the strongest warriors. "Captain," Margaret greeted her warmly, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit. I can't thank you enough for your team's tireless work in apprehending Garrett. You've done the regiment proud." Sarah accepted the offered seat, a small smile softening the hard planes of her face. "We were just doing our job, Ma'am, upholding the legacy and the values that men like Colonel Blackwood fought so hard to instill in us." Margaret nodded, a flicker of pain passing behind her eyes at the mention of her late husband. James always said that the true measure of a Green Beret wasn't in the missions they completed or the enemies they defeated, but in the strength of the principles they upheld. He knew that the real battle was always within, the daily choice to put duty and honor above all else, a choice that some find harder to make than others, Sarah said softly, her gaze distant. "Garrett was one of us once, a brother in arms, a warrior trusted to uphold the highest standards of our craft. To see him fall so far, to turn his back on everything we stand for." She trailed off, her jaw clenching with the effort to control her emotions. Margaret reached across the desk, laying a gentle hand over Sarah's clenched fist. "The betrayal of a brother cuts deeper than any enemy's blade," she said, her voice heavy with understanding. "But we can't let the actions of a few lost souls tarnish the legacy of the many who serve with unwavering integrity. Lazarus made his choices, and now he'll face the consequences. Our task is to ensure that his fate serves as a warning to others who might be tempted by the same false promises." Sarah met Margaret's eyes, drawing strength from the older woman's unwavering resolve. "How do we do that?" she asked, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "How do we keep fighting, knowing that there will always be another Lazarus waiting in the shadows?" Margaret leaned back, a slow smile spreading across her face. "We do what James always did," she said, a note of steel entering her voice. "We adapt, we innovate, and we never, ever stop believing in the power of our principles. Lazarus thought he could break us by turning our own against us, but all he did was prove the strength of the bonds that unite us. Bonds forged in shared sacrifice, shared purpose, and an unshakable commitment to something greater than ourselves." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the museum's serene grounds. In the distance, the mountains loomed, their rugged peaks a silent testament to the enduring nature of the warrior spirit. The cartel will regroup, and new threats will emerge, Margaret continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But we'll be ready. We'll take the lessons learned from this battle and use them to build an even stronger defense, not just here at the museum, but across the entire Special Forces network. We'll honor James's legacy by ensuring that his vision, a global community of warriors united in common cause, endures long after we're gone." Sarah rose to join Margaret at the window, her shoulders squared with newfound determination. "Where do we start?" she asked, the weariness in her voice replaced by a note of eager anticipation. Margaret turned to her, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "Why, with the next generation, of course. James always said that the true strength of the Green Berets lay not in any individual soldier, but in the unbroken chain of knowledge, skill, and dedication passed down from one generation to the next. It's time we redouble our efforts to forge those links to ensure that the lessons of the past remain alive and relevant in the battles yet to come. She moved to her desk, picking up a well-worn, leather-bound journal. James left a lifetime of wisdom in these pages, she said, running a reverent finger over the cover. Strategies, tactics, philosophical musings on the nature of warfare and the warrior's place in the world. It was his way of ensuring that his experiences, his insights, would live on long after his passing. Margaret held out the journal to Sarah, a solemn light in her eyes. "I want you to have this," she said softly. "Study it, absorb its lessons, and then pass them on to your team. Use it as a foundation to build new training programs, to infuse the next wave of Delta operators with the same uncompromising standards and unwavering dedication that defined James's legacy." Sarah accepted the journal with trembling hands, her eyes widening with the weight of the responsibility being entrusted to her. I don't know what to say," she stammered, clutching the precious volume to her chest. "This is an incredible honor, Margaret. I swear to you, I'll do everything in my power to ensure that Colonel Blackwood's wisdom lives on through my team and through every soldier we train." Margaret smiled, a warm light chasing away the shadows in her eyes. "I know you will, Sarah. James saw the same potential in you that he saw in all his most promising recruits. A fierce intelligence, an unbreakable spirit, and a moral compass that would never waver, no matter how hard the winds of adversity might blow. With you leading the charge, I have no doubt that the regiment will emerge from this trial stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to the principles that define us." The two women stood in silence for a long moment, united by a bond that transcended rank or generation. The bond of shared purpose, of a common dream for a world where honor, courage, and unwavering service to a higher cause reigned supreme. Finally, Sarah straightened, tucking the journal carefully into her inner pocket. "I should get back to the team," she said, a note of reluctance in her voice. "There's a lot of work to be done, and not a moment to waste." Margaret nodded, pride shining in her eyes as she watched the young captain prepare to depart. "Remember, Sarah," she called after her, "you're not just fighting for today, or even for tomorrow. You're fighting for a legacy that will endure long after all of us are gone. Draw strength from that knowledge and let it guide you through whatever challenges lie ahead." Sarah paused at the door, turning back to face Margaret with a small, determined smile. "I will," she promised, her voice ringing with conviction. "And when the time comes for me to pass the torch to the next generation, I hope I can do so with even half the grace, wisdom, and unwavering dedication that you've shown us all." With a final crisp salute, Sarah disappeared through the door, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and memories. She moved back to the window, her gaze drifting once more to the mountains that had been her constant companions through so many years of joy, sorrow, and ceaseless vigilance. "You'd be proud of them, James," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with unshakable certainty. "The warriors you trained, the legacy you built, it lives on in every soldier who stands ready to defend our way of life, no matter the cost. Lazarus thought he could extinguish your light, but all he did was ensure that it will burn brighter, spread further than even you could have ever imagined." A gentle breeze stirred the trees outside, carrying with it the faint echo of distant laughter. The sound of visiting Green Berets exchanging stories, forging bonds, and recommitting themselves to the timeless principles that had brought them together. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her like a balm, a reminder of the enduring power of the community James had built. A community that would continue to thrive and grow long after the Lazaruses of the world had faded into footnotes of history. With a deep breath, Margaret turned from the window, squaring her shoulders and setting her sights on the battles to come. There was work to be done, a new generation of warriors to guide and inspire, and an unending vigil to maintain against those who would seek to subvert the very foundations of their way of life. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, Margaret allowed herself a small, private smile, a tribute to the man whose love, wisdom, and unflagging dedication had set her on this path so many years ago, and whose spirit continued to guide her every step. "Till Valhalla, my love," she murmured, reaching up to touch the locket that held James's picture close to her heart. "Till Valhalla, and all the battles yet to come." And with that whispered promise, Margaret Blackwood turned to face the future, a future filled with challenges and dangers, to be sure, but also with the unshakable knowledge that as long as warriors like her stood ready to defend the principles of honor, duty, and unwavering service, no force on earth could ever truly defeat them. In the heart of the Sierra County Mountains, nestled amid rugged peaks and whispering pines, the Blackwood Museum stood as a silent sentinel, a testament to the enduring power of a warrior's spirit and to the unbreakable bonds of a community forged in the fires of shared struggle and unending vigilance. And at its heart, guiding and guarding in equal measure, Margaret Blackwood herself, widow, keeper of the flame, and warrior without equal in the battle for the soul of a nation. "Let the Lazaruses of the world tremble," she thought fiercely, her eyes alight with the fire of 1,000 battles yet unfought. For as long as the Green Beret legacy endured, as long as the lessons of James Blackwood's life and sacrifice remained a guiding light for generations of warriors yet to come, there would always be a reckoning for those who dared to betray the sacred trust of the silent professionals who stood ever ready to defend the defenseless, to uphold the cause of justice and honor against all who would seek to subvert it. That was the promise Margaret had made to herself, to James, and to the countless warriors who had passed through the hallowed halls of the museum. A promise sealed in blood, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that defined them. And it was a promise she intended to keep, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, until the day she drew her last breath and joined her beloved husband in the halls of Valhalla. For that was the way of the true warrior, the way of honor, of duty, and of a love that transcended life itself. And in the end, as the sun set over the mountains and the sounds of a new generation of Green Berets rose to fill the evening air, Margaret knew that there was no greater legacy she could hope to leave behind. Here is the conclusion to the story, with a call to action for readers to subscribe and share. As the dust settled on the cartel's failed incursion, and the Blackwood Museum returned to its role as a living memorial, Margaret reflected on the enduring legacy of her late husband James and the unbreakable spirit of the Special Forces community he had dedicated his life to building. Though the immediate threat had been neutralized, Margaret knew that the battle against those who would subvert honor and duty for personal gain was far from over. New challenges would arise, and fresh enemies would emerge from the shadows, seeking to exploit any perceived weakness in the armor of the warrior ethos. But as Margaret gazed out over the serene grounds of the museum, watching a new generation of Green Berets training and bonding under the watchful eye of Captain Sarah Martinez, she felt a profound sense of hope and determination. The legacy that James had entrusted to her, the sacred duty of upholding the values that defined the regiment, was in good hands and would continue to be passed down, unbroken and unbowed, for generations to come. With a quiet smile, Margaret returned to her work, secure in the knowledge that as long as warriors like those gathered at the Blackwood Museum stood ready to defend the defenseless and uphold the cause of justice, no force on earth could ever truly defeat them. The battle would go on, and Margaret would be there to lead the charge, honoring her husband's memory with every step and forging a legacy that would endure long after she had joined him in the halls of Valhalla. And so, dear readers, we come to the end of this tale, but not to the end of Margaret's mission or of the enduring power of the Green Beret spirit. If you've been inspired by this story of courage, honor, and unwavering dedication, I invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Together, we can ensure that the lessons and legacy of heroes like James and Margaret Blackwood are never forgotten, and that their example continues to inspire new generations of warriors and leaders. Thank you for joining me on this journey and for your support in spreading the message of duty, service, and unbreakable compassion. Until our next adventure together, stay safe, stay strong, and always remember, the true strength of a warrior lies not in their ability to fight, but in their unwavering commitment to the principles that define them.